We're going to talk about relational dialectics today. It is something that corresponds to Chapter 10 on maintaining interpersonal relationships in your books. The theory was developed by Leslie Baxter and colleagues, and to be honest with you, it's fairly complicated, and so I'm going to try to make some of it as easy as possible. The theory is based on several concepts that you have to understand, but the main idea is that relationships are not stable. So in your book, they talk a lot about relationship maintenance and things that you can do to maintain your relationship. But see, that assumes that the relationship would be in a steady state, or that you could maintain it in a steady state. This theory takes the point of view that relationships are constantly changing all the time, or there are many forces that are affecting our relationships all the time. And so you can't really maintain anything, but you can manage the relationship. A dialectical tension, and we'll talk about this later on, is a push-pull between two seemingly contradictory needs. So, for example, in a relationship, you have a need for excitement and spontaneity with the other person, but you also have the need for predictability so that you can trust the other person and have some measure of security as well. And that would be an example of that push-pull between those two opposite types of needs. There are some concepts that are important to know, and the first is process. This takes the point of view that relationships are in a constant state of flux or constant state of change. So it's not a stable state. Process is what allows relationships, though, to grow and transform. So there's process, there's contradiction, and I'm just going to read to you. Contradiction occurs when two tendencies or forces are interdependent yet mutually negate each other. So remember, I was talking about how this is a little bit complicated, but basically what that's saying is you can't know something without knowing its opposite. So you can't know darkness unless you know light. So you can't know what it means to be connected to somebody unless you know what it feels like to be disconnected with somebody. So that's all part of contradiction. And again, change. Change is caused by struggle. Change is caused by the tension of contradiction. And every day, although we tend to think of our relationships as being stable, every day we make choices, and those choices either maintain the status quo or they perpetuate changes. But forces are always in motion, relationships are always in flux, and we're always managing them. We tend to think of relationships as being fairly stable, though, because change tends to occur at a fairly slow rate. So that's change. And then the next thing that kind of undergirds the theory is called praxis. And again, this is the complicated part. It means that people are producers and products of their social worlds. Basically, we create our world, we create our relationships through the decisions that we make in terms of how to behave with them and how to communicate with them. So that's what praxis means. It has to do with our decisions that affect our relationships. There are several types of dialectics, and we're going to talk about categories of dialectics next, and then we're going to talk about different ways to manage dialectics. So basically, there are three broad categories and there are subcategories. And the first category is integration versus separation. Basically, people want to feel that they are part of something larger than themselves, so they want to be in a relationship, but yet we also want our independence. Now, here are another terms that you'll need to know that correspond with these categories. Every dialectic, for example, integration and separation, has an internal manifestation. That's something that occurs between the two parties in the relationship, and an external manifestation. And that's something that has to do with the tension between the parties in the relationship, or the couple, or the outside world, or the larger society. So we've got integration and separation. The internal manifestation is called connection versus autonomy. So again, we want to be close, but at the same time, we're a separate human being and we have needs to be independent as well. So it's possible to get too much connection, it's possible to get too much independence. Externally, the external manifestation of integration versus separation has to do with the amount of time that we spend with other people in the social network, that would be inclusion, versus the time we spend alone as a couple, which would be seclusion. So we have needs again to have a network of friends and family and social support, but at the same time we need private time for our relationships as well. And the next broad dialectic is called stability versus change. So we want security on one hand and we want excitement on the other. And the internal manifestation is called predictability versus novelty. So again, we want predictability. We want to be able to trust the person. We want to be able to count on the other person. At the same time, we want a certain amount of spontaneity, novelty, and excitement. And so that's the internal manifestation. The external manifestation of this category is conventionality versus uniqueness. So we tend to want certain standards, like a lot of us will want to get married and we'll want to own a home, we'll want a dog and a cat and 2 children and the American dream and all of those things that we kind of get from society. But at the same time, we will want to be special and we'll want to be unique. So we might write our own wedding vows or celebrate holidays in a unique way. And then the third broad category is expression versus privacy. And the internal manifestation of that is openness versus closedness. So we want to tell private things to the other person. At the same time, we also want to have, most of the time, some things kept to ourselves. Those are things that we just don't want our partner to know. It may hurt the other partner's feelings, for example. And the external manifestation has to do with revelation and concealment. So we might want to talk to our friends about problems we're having in our marriage, but at the same time, we might not want to do that. So you might want that support you can get from a friend, but you might want to keep the information to yourself because you might not want to put you or your partner in a bad light. Who knows? So those are the broad categories, and then there are different ways of actually managing these dialectics. And the first is called selection. Some people decide that they're only going to be totally open with one another. And so they've selected the openness part of the openness versus closedness. The problem with that is sometimes if we actually did tell the other person everything, it could be hurtful. Or we may just have a need that we're ignoring to keep some things to ourselves. We have separation, and that has to do with favoring each side of the dialectic, but at different times. So there are 2 ways you can do that. So there's 2 subcategories. The first is called cyclic alternation, and that involves moving from one side of the dialectical pole at different times. So for example, as soon as partners start feeling that they're getting too disconnected, they might arrange for a date night or something like that so they could spend some quality time together. The other way would be topical segmentation, and that involves emphasizing different sides of the dialectic depending on the context. So people may decide that they'll reveal positive information about their relationship with their friends, but they will conceal negative information. And that's one way of doing that. The next one is called neutralization, and that's where you avoid engaging either side of the dialectic. One way you can do that is through moderation. So you try to have a midpoint between autonomy and connection, a midpoint between openness and closedness. The next one would be disqualification, and that is when you try to be ambiguous so you don't ever fully engage either side of the dialectic. So one way that you could do that would just be by changing the tactic, changing the subject when something comes up, that kind of thing. And the final strategy is called reframing, and that's considered a fairly sophisticated strategy where you just learn to reconceptualize the entire dialectic. So, for example, partners realize if they share everything with one another, they may be too predictable, and they may decide that a little mystery is a good thing, or that if they get too close, that they're going to lose their individual identity, and having their individual identity makes the relationship work. that maybe it's a good thing that partners have time that they spend with their friends, and they don't regard that as a bad thing. They regard that as a good thing, because then when they spend more time with one another, it's just a lot more fun because they appreciate each other more. So there are all kinds of different ways to manage these tensions. Research has shown that satisfied couples are a good way, or find good ways to balance these needs. So you may want to think about the different ways that you manage those tensions in your relationships, and maybe you could try some new things, such as reframing, thinking about things different, or some of the other ways that we've just talked about. Thank you.